Welcome, everyone. So happy to have everyone with us today for another edition of Stand Alone, where we take charge of our life, where we lead our life. And I cannot think of having anyone better than the one and only Brandon Webb. You know, when you break down what he has gone through, number one, first and foremost, it is an honor and a privilege to be in your presence. And thank you for saying yes to this interview and us meeting, because when you read this book, and everyone needs to grab this, he's a multiple New York Times bestseller. But when you read this book about focus, what Brandon will teach you is how you have to, your default has to be no nowadays, right? So I'm so grateful that your default wasn't no with us and that you accepted this invitation. But Brandon, just to introduce you to our audience, 13 years in the Navy, the majority of that time as a Navy SEAL. When 9/11 happened, you were deployed to Afghanistan. You were an advanced sniper instructor. So you taught Chris Kyle, you taught Marcus Luttrell. You were in charge of redesigning the sniper instructor program to modernize it. And in 2006, you left the Navy. You could have stayed there. You could have decided to make sure that, let's hit retirement. But you did what most people are itching to do now. You went and ventured off into being an entrepreneur. Your first business didn't go so well, but how you ended with your second business is really what I want to dive into today. How do we go from wind zero to hurricane group and all the things in between? It's a beautiful, beautiful story. And the way you talked about it, Brandon, I just want to say, I commend you on your writing. I know you have a new book out now, which everyone needs to grab, and I'll introduce that at the end because this is a big deal, right? So Brandon, to kick us off, there's a lot of high performers in my audience. And, I can't think of anything more high performing than being a Navy SEAL. So first off, I just want to say thank you for the honor and privilege of you giving us your time today. And I really wanted to kick off. My first question to you is, in a world today where we are so distracted, a lot of people think of focus, and you break this down so excellent in the book where you talk about tunnel vision versus total focus. Why can we not afford to have tunnel vision? And what is the difference between front sight focus? And how can this help us to really achieve the dreams that we have? Because you're an achiever, and learning from you is really what the world needs right now, because we need to get focused. There's too many things that are sidetracking us and getting us really scattered in our attention. So what's the difference, Brandon?
Yeah. Well, what I try to do with total focus was just describe my own journey. I think many entrepreneurs probably suffer from ADHD. We're chasing back when my mom wanted to give me up to the public authorities because I was a 5-year-old terror. I don't even know if they knew what ADHD was, but the doctor was like, just find something for him to do. So she got me into sports. But getting out of the Navy, I had, especially in 2006, when the Navy SEALs were just kind of coming on the world stage in the media, myself and a few others had started to write books about our experience, but there weren't too many SEALs that were out in my peer group. Most of the guys stayed in. So I found myself in this situation where offers were being thrown at me left and right, be on this board, help start this company. And I was just chasing all this stuff. And I told the story in the book that really resonated with me about my interaction with this guy that wanted shooting lessons. And I didn't want to do the lessons because it's the last thing I want to do is go teach some rich guy how to shoot a rifle. Go hang some line in his study or that he shouldn't be shooting in the first place. But anyway, I had this amazing interaction interaction with this guy named Todd Dackerman, and he said to me, wow, like over lunch one day, you have all this stuff going on. You had Win Zero, now you have this textiles company, and you have this going, and you're like, I had like 2 startups and I was on a couple different boards. And he said, you remind me of myself when I was younger. I was chasing so many different things. Only when I decided to focus on one opportunity did I start to experience success. So I really took that to heart. And it was at that point I decided to kind of go all in with our first website in Hurricane Group, which is still our biggest today, sofrep.com. It's a kind of special foreign policy defense news site that I continue to run along with some other websites. But that showed me, wow, this is really effective. And I think it comes down to capacity, like our individual capacity. There's only so many days in a year, so many hours in a day. And we are so distracted by the internet, and everybody, has a phone, and it's like we're so sucked into our phones a lot, and we're distracted by internet advertising, stories, clickbait lines. And so it's more important ever than today to kind of focus on not just career. I think if I had to choose, like really distill it down, you have family, personal, which is kind of, you can lump that into it would be like, and then career. So you really have 3, whoops, I held up 4 fingers. 3 things that you really have to pay attention to. And if you ignore one of those or spend too much time, then you see relationships start to crumble. Career, if you spend too much time on your personal or on the family side, then the career suffers. So you kind of got to manage these 3 things, not all the times equally, because stuff happens in life. But I think we really have to focus and pay attention to these 3 things. Also, to make my answer even longer,
okay.
I do think I always run up into this. People go, well, what about people like Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, and I'm like, well, they're billionaires. Like when you have $1 billion of capital, buy a lot of capacity. You can do a lot of things because you have tremendous amount of resources. Most people don't have that, right? Like, most people who even I have friends who are very wealthy, they don't have the ability to go start a company to fly rockets into space and revolutionize several industries at once with solar powered vehicles and batteries and stuff like that. So I guess my point is, the world is constantly, that we live in, is constantly grabbing for attention, and we really have to figure out how to say no to things, no to opportunities, no to people trying to grab time. I just got a text before I came on the show. This guy is a friend in my Harvard group, and he's like, oh, my friend of mine wants to go to Puerto Rico where I'm a resident. Can you give him your time? And I'm like, look, like, have him go, like, here's some links to articles, but don't just come at me and suck my time and knowledge that you could just find easily for yourself on the internet, right? so I'm very protective of my time. But anyway, I think that more than answered that question. I'll shut up now.
No. And, we really want to learn from you, because what's so remarkable about your journey is that it was never a moment where you weren't learning. It was never a moment where you were like prideful to the point where, like, I have all the answers. I'm a Navy SEAL. There's nothing I cannot do. Like, get out of my way. I own you, which you have every right to think that way. But the way that you made these strategic connections with, smart business people to learn more about business, as opposed to like special operating forces, and then apply that into your website of the SofRep. So to make sure that you could add value to the customer and then grow a viable business. I love that you brought up that interaction with Todd, because you didn't want to do that. And sometimes it's the things that we don't want to do that, like, there's a moment where an exchange of information happens. But if your mind isn't ready to be a learner, what happens is you shut out that. And you could have taken that and said, like, who are you to tell me what to do? And I wanted to talk about this because I think so many people can learn from this today, especially the younger generation, where you do have access to so much information today. You have to be able to distill and have the discernment. And I love that you talk about situational awareness. I have been studying a lot about special operating forces because it was about fine-tuning my knowledge, but then still having a breadth of knowledge to be able to tap into. Can you explain to us, what is situational awareness as opposed to having that front sight focus, and why we kind of need to go in between those things? It's not one or the other. It is the combination of both that makes you do really well. And the truth is, in business, you need both. You can't have one or the other. So if you can explain that difference to everyone, that would be great.
Yeah. So for me, front sight focus is a lot of it has to do with this, making the decision, okay, I'm going to focus on this. This is my core business. I want to focus on this, develop a plan that and people plan all sorts of different ways, right? People have 20-year plan, 5-year plan. I kind of have a 1 year, a 5 year, and more of a longer term outlook. And I review that every year. And once I know, okay, this is where the direction I want to take my company, then the decisions become, when you spend enough time on strategy and focus, then the decision-making process becomes easier, because opportunities that come into your world, you can tell instantly, okay, this is aligned with where I want to go, or it's not. And if it's no, it's huge. Because especially in today, even COVID, right? You have to be, as a business owner, paying attention to what's happening, with how this is affecting business, right? Your ability to borrow capital, whether it's the payroll protection program. People realize, a lot of my friends running big businesses, that the big bank isn't necessarily a great idea. A big bank isn't really helpful in a crisis like this. The big banks, they were just lost in the shuffle. It doesn't matter if they're a $20 million business, the big bank is helping a $100 million business. And so a lot of people saw that these big companies, I think it's crazy what the Small Business Administration considers a small business. I think it's 100 million or less in revenue. So it's kind of a crazy distinction. So these big companies, were loaning their most important customers money first, and the other guys were left hanging. So being able to kind of have the situational awareness, always be paying attention to what's happening in the world, in the global situation, or maybe the more a smaller geographic location. If you're a business that does business in a certain state or city, okay, what's happening to the local politics, my tax rates. And that's called, I call it reading the world. You really have to constantly have that situational awareness to see what the trends are happening. I would not want to, I look at businesses to buy for fun, these business broker sites. I see all these gas station chains. It's I don't want to own a gas station. That business is dead in 20 years, right? No one's going to the gas station. Will it become? Maybe a charging station? I don't know. Right. But selling gas, to me, is not a sustainable business. There are a lot of other businesses, when you start thinking about, okay, how the future is evolving. How do I future-proof my business? I think that's part of it as well. For instance, we did a case study on truck driving, which by the way is the number one employer of people in the United States is truck driver. It's insane, and that industry is predicted to go fully autonomous in, I think, 20 to 30 years. So imagine like the cascade effect of that job going away and what impact that has not only on our American economy, but also on like how does that not only affect the truck driver, but what other industries are affected by that? So that's what I like to think of, like situational awareness and reading the world, because people get clobbered. Like there's so many, like look what the internet did to small town America and booksellers, right? Like it just became like caused massive disruption, and people that weren't paying attention and couldn't adapt were done. I knew a cab driver in London. They have these black cabs. You have to take this extensive test and study for like a year or two to memorize the center of London. It's like the one, I think, mile circumference of downtown London to pass this test as a taxi driver. Well, Uber comes to London, totally disrupts the black cabs. And these are like a very prestigious, high-paying job. And I remember being in London 3 or 4 years ago, and I took a tour by this guy that was an ex-black cab driver. He still had his license, but he said, look, I'm not going to fight Uber. I know that that's not going to be a winning strategy for me. So I decided to turn my knowledge of London into a private tour company. And that's what this guy does. He gives these amazing private tours in his cab. He can take his cab places normal cars can't go. To me, that's like keeping an open mind and adapting as opposed to fighting progress, right? Like how many taxi drivers did we see picketing Uber? I'm like, guys, like right. Not to mention like the car will be driving itself probably in 5 to 10 years anyway. So, but that's situational awareness. It's really, really important. And as of my mom is an entrepreneur, she used to have a coffee and tea manufacturing business with her best friend, who they started as a coffee shop and then started making their own mixes and decided to get into manufacturing. But they were constantly paying attention. My mom would call me and bitch about the price of sugar. She's like, God, the sugar just went crazy. So like watching these commodity trends, it's pretty wild. But anyway, that situational awareness is super important to anybody in career and in business.
Yeah. And, when you think about your upbringing too, this is why, especially for people that are so excited to get into business, a lot of young people today, they're like, I want to be a serial entrepreneur. And you touched on that. Like Elon Musk can be a serial entrepreneur. You need to hunker down and focus and really get so good in your industry. And this is where it leads into, you mentioned this, it's called violence of action. And I love this because when you see people that are, I call them dabblers, right? They're dabbling in this business. But for you went into the digital media business and you engulfed yourself into it. You really read everything you could get your hands on it. And that allowed you to take what is called a violence of action. I love this terminology. There's something about war that marries very well with business. When I got into business, I said one thing to myself, like, don't be a little bitch, toughen up. So I taught myself how to be what I call a business warrior. So I love learning everything about war. And when I hear this thing, violence and action, I don't know if I'm sick, but it makes me excited. But can you explain this to people when I see people today and they're trying to have balance and they're trying to do everything? And I'm like, you're going to die. You're going to be devastated. What is violence of action? Why, when you're starting a business, do you have to apply this mindset to take off and do well?
So the kind of sealed definition of violence of action is we're operating in small units. So the thing is, how do we overwhelm a much larger fighting force? Well, a very good plan, unconventional tactics. I could I have a good unconventional story I'll share with in a minute, but the whole purpose is hit them so fast, so hard that they don't have time to react. And then by the time they've figured out what happened, it's over, like game over. And that happened in Afghanistan when I deployed with SEAL Team 3. I went on very high risk, dangerous operations, but we would hit the target so quick, so fast in the middle of the night, like, at hours and weather conditions that, normal people just want to sit inside and they're sleeping in a warm house. But we would hit them in the middle of the night. And by the time they figured out what happened, they're already like zip tied and the hoods are over their head. And they're like, their guns are still tilted up next to the bed. They don't even have time to react. So that's like the military explanation. What I talk about in Total Focus is the same way, like the dabblers that you mentioned, right? So many people like, just kind of like toe in the water. It's like, look, if you're going to do something, you need to go all in. And sometimes it doesn't work out, but at least you figured it out much quicker than dabbling for 5 years, as opposed to just going, you know what, I'm going all out on this idea or career change and kind of all in. And it happened to me recently in the pandemic. I'd sold a e-commerce company that needed to sell. Like we had major supply chain issues with COVID, and it was a subscription box company called Crate Club. Ended up selling to a competitor, and my CMO, who was a rock star, her name is Alda. She's like, okay, what am I going to do next? And I said, well, we did some online research, and I said, okay, what's our COVID kind of bet? And she's like, well, I think maybe kids vitamins. So we did a vitamin startup, but we raised a little bit of money. I put my own money in. And 3 weeks ago, we had to make the hard decision. Like, look, we're not scaling fast enough. We have some retail opportunities, but we really don't want to do retail. So we wound it up, but that went from 0 to wind up in a year and a half. But we had branding, product, manufactured in Florida. We were shipping to customers. Like we got it. We got her done pretty quick. But and sometimes it doesn't work, but hey, for sure, I'm not sitting back going, God, I wish I had tried that kids vitamin thing. Right. It's like, okay, I did it. And in that case, I had a little bit of capital and it wasn't my business. I'm like, Alda, you're the CEO, you run it. I'll be on your board of advisors. But anyway, that's violence of action, but it's important kind of when you make that decision. No, I think you're wasting your time dabbling. And I don't know anyone that's dabbled and really had a lot of success.
Yeah, I think that's a very important message for people to hear, because you're going to have to make some pivots and some changes in your business, but that's a completely different conversation. One of the things about your book is you're really amazing at writing. I read a lot, and some books are hard to read because you're like, oh my goodness, this is just like, but that's why I'm so excited for, Steel Fear that came out recently, and to hear this other version of your writing. But when we talk about pivoting, because you pivot with your writing, but in your business, you had this great example in here where you were talking about how you had the advertisers that were kind of, controlling you. And, in that moment, you had this thing where you wanted to do something different. It's like a bug in every entrepreneur. Like, you don't want anyone telling you what to do. That's why you got into business. And these advertisers were starting to control the dialogue, control the narrative of what you could do and release in your business. And then you made a decision to pivot. If you could break that down and why that's so incredibly important for entrepreneurs to have this skill today. And that's really what Stand Alone is about. Like, stand your ground. Like, when you know something in your core, don't get led, start leading. If you can talk about how you switched your model and how that turned into an exponential increase for you.
Yeah. So when I started SoftRep, it was mostly about interviews, modern military, some military history. But what I found was our writers, both men and women, were were writing for the site, and they were noticed something happened in Afghanistan that the New York Times misreported, or any one of the big media outlets, because the way modern news media is, they're so risk adverse, and even the New York Times, it's very hard for somebody in the New York Times to get sent to, say, like some faraway African country to report on some conflict. And so what I found out was my writers cared about what was happening in the world, and the fact that people were getting it wrong in the mainstream media. So we started, all of a sudden, this thing I started turned into, we started breaking news, because it was like, whoa, I just called my buddy who's in the forward air base in Iraq, and he'll tell me what's going on. And he said the intel officer told him this. So we had like incredible sources. And we started breaking big news. And one of the stories that we were covering was, I had served with this guy, Chris Beck, at SEAL Team 3. I went on my career path, and Beck went on his own. Well, Beck stayed in. And one of the reasons, back to situational awareness, the reason I decided to get out in 2006 as a 13-year Navy SEAL chief, I was paying attention to what the hell was going on in the world. I'm like, we're in Iraq, we're in Africa, we're in Afghanistan, and I'm seeing my own SEAL community just get over deployed. Like they were just too much. You can't send somebody to deploy 15 to 20 times in a combat zone without a break. You're going to have some serious trauma. And I started to see this, and I said, I don't want to put myself into this machine. So I decided to get out, spend more time with my family, because I was seeing what was happening on the horizon with the situational awareness. So now I'm running SoftRep after my first business failed, which I talk about in detail in Total Focus. And this guy, Chris Beck, had retired. And through the SEAL kind of network, I found out that Chris, who was working at the Special Operations Command as a contractor, retired contractor, had made the decision to come out as transgender. And her and I had this conversation, and she was, struggling with the whole like identity thing, and it's a difficult transition, and it happened in a very macho, manly environment. Imagine being this bearded Navy SEAL, and Chris is now Kristen, right? It's crazy stuff. And we ended up breaking the story on SoftRep. And the morning we had a meeting with one of our largest advertisers, who is in the banking and insurance industry, and as you know, and at the insurance, a very conservative group of people. And we had met with them, and we briefed them on like next year's campaign, what we can do to kind of drive more business for them through advertising. And I said, oh, by the way, here's kind of like the latest stories. This is an important story we broke just this morning. So I leave that meeting, and it's like, by the time I got from the meeting, the office in Texas, to the airport, I got an email from the advertising agency that said to pull all these ads off the network, like shut down the entire campaign. And it was because they didn't want to be around that story. And I was like blown away, because this was a military, had a large military customer base. And I'm like, your customer base is broad and diverse. And for sure, the LGBT community is a part of that. Like, I got really angry. I'm like, how can you pull your advertising on this important kind of cultural story we're doing? Then Anderson Cooper's team reached out to me from CNN, and I ended up going on Anderson Cooper and setting up the interview with Kristen, and we ended up helping with the documentary they did called Lady Valor. So once it hit mainstream CNN, then the ad agency is like, oh, okay, we can turn the ads back on. But it was an important lesson to me, because this advertiser is spending over $1 million a year with us. To see that $1 million like go up in smoke scared the shit out of me. And I said, now I understand, why advertisers do have such influence on content. Because if they don't like a story, a certain thing, they will put pressure. And we've seen it now, I think, more with the age of the internet. There's more visibility into this. But I said, you know what? I want to go subscription because we'll have more editorial autonomy. And look, we still deal with, because advertising is a part of our business. We still do deal with upset advertisers that don't want to be around certain content. And typically, it's like stories that are controversial, right? Gun ownership, the first transgender Navy SEAL, these kind of like cultural issues that are, sometimes politically charged. So, but it's important to have these conversations. I think now more than ever in America. One of the reasons why Newsweek reached out to us, and the CEO, Dev, is a great guy. He says, look, I really like what you guys are doing, and you're trying to be apolitical and not spin this. He's like, that's kind of aligned with what we're doing. We'd love to kind of work with you guys. So we just started that relationship with Newsweek. But anyway, that was a huge pivot for us to go. At that time, we were 90% of our revenue was advertising, and 10% was maybe some affiliate linking. Now 90% of our revenue is subscription. So it was a huge impact on our business. And I think people respected us for telling them, look, the reason we're going subscription is because of this. And we laid it out to the customers, and it was I would say, overwhelmingly positive response. A few dissenters, but like, there'll always be naysayers, right? But it was the best decision for us at the time, and still really glad we went subscription, because we are in full control of our editorial process. And this whole cancel culture today, which is interesting. I think there's something there. Like, I do think that I was having this conversation on James Altucher podcast yesterday. I think that we can't rely on government to fix the problems we have in America, with big problems like healthcare, education, economic. Like, it's up to us in the business community to take a stand, for women's equality in the workplace, all this stuff. Now you're seeing companies take these stands. I think, Nike, I respect, because they take bold stands, and sometimes they're like, no, this is the right side of the equation to be on. So we are part of this cancel culture. I think there are some good aspects of it, but we broke a story about 4 servicemen that got ambushed in Niger, Africa. And people have forgot about it. They forgot these 4 Americans lost their lives. It was like a blip in the news cycle. We found a video from they captured, these guys were wearing GoPros. And this terrorist group put a YouTube video up. And so we grabbed the video, edited, put some explanation, and said, look, here's what's happening in Niger. Like, you need to know about it. And people were outraged. Like, we had 50,000 people sign a petition to get us to take the story down. And I'm like, look, you can be outraged, and it sucks to see people dying on camera, but this is real. This isn't Call of Duty, the video game. These are 4 young men that lost their lives in part of the world that nobody even knew US troops had a presence. And actually, the benefit, one of the fathers reached out to us and said, look, it was hard for me to watch that video, but I'm so thankful that you guys made this a big thing, and now people are talking about it and know about it. And it had an impact. Like, the people that were responsible in the Army got reprimanded, because these guys should have been wearing GoPros on this operation. They shouldn't have been out doing what they were doing, but it created accountability, which I think that's the service that the news community should be providing, like as objective reporting as possible, and having it be a mechanism for accountability. But anyway, that's a little bit about my story. Sometimes it's stressful. But,
yeah. And I think it's so good to talk about this, because this is what's missing in the world today. You know, we hear these sound bites, like a 30-second little, sound bite of what is going on. And then we draw our own conclusions based on our own, biases. But I think it's so incredibly important that when you say like companies have a responsibility now, I always know that a company is a person, like you are behind that company. And in that moment, if you didn't take a stand, you would have sold out to like that advertiser really owning you in that moment.
Yeah.
And what people really want right now is the truth. We just want to know what's really going on. And I commend you and your site for just being a source of real information and, standing your ground, because the people they're your customer instead of, the bigger companies, the advertisers, all that other stuff. So I love that. When you talk about your eyes, this is why I love talking to CEOs and people that are in charge of influential businesses, because it really matters what you see, like for how you train your eyes. How do you keep up with the times? Like knowing what you know, how do you make it not shut you down? Because it could be overwhelming. And I love that you said that word, in violence of action, you overwhelm instead of you getting overwhelmed. So knowing what you know, because it's a wealth of knowledge, what you've experienced, the people that you know, how do you make it a point to keep moving forward and not just get overwhelmed? This is where a lot of people are stuck today. It's information overload. We don't know what's true anymore. Even taking with what happened to Afghanistan, people on the ground. How do you still make sure that you are productive, that you are fruitful instead of getting overwhelmed by the information?
So a couple things that I do. I have a few sources where I get my information. Like economists generally a pretty good source of information with what's happening geopolitically in the world. I do read a variety of different news sources and business in the business world. I belong to a Harvard alumni group, a business school group. I belong to YPO, which is Young Presidents Organization. YPO is amazing. Before that, I was in a group called EO, Entrepreneurs Organization. EO is all entrepreneurs. I joined the New York chapter probably 6 years ago before I became eligible for YPO, which are, there's a bigger revenue threshold to pass for YPO. But being in these groups, you have access to so many business people and who are constantly sharing information, best practices, changes in tax law, changes in privacy on the internet. So I think surrounding yourself with people is probably what had the most impact on me. The Harvard experience, I went to this program called OPM. It's a 2-year kind of entrepreneurs MBA for business owners. I have friends from this class all over the world. I'm going to my friend Mohammed's wedding in December. His company was the one that got that ship unstuck from the Suez Canal.
Wow.
So it's just like such an amazing, diverse group of people all over the world now who are part of like this chat group I'm in, and we share information. Hey, this is happening in the world of cryptocurrency. This is, happening, with different laws in different countries. So I learned about Portugal. Portugal is a great tax haven and a place to get residency easily. If you have a decent sized business, you can apply for visa in Portugal, all sorts of benefits. I pay attention to this stuff. I had no idea that going to university abroad was so much cheaper. My son is at St. Andrews, which is an Oxford school system. He's a computer science major, and for one of the top schools in the UK, I'm paying about $30,000 a year tuition, where decent school in the US is probably 40, 50K. A school that he would have got into, I'd be paying probably 100K a year tuition. And my daughter's 17. She's really into art and design. She has a small business selling. She does artwork on sneakers, and she does vintage clothes that she paints on and sells on Etsy. And she got hired by Saks during the pandemic, 2020. She was in Saks, 16 years old, getting paid $500 a day to do sneaker art for Puma. So
good for her.
But she's a badass. But Eindhoven in Netherlands, one of the top design schools, it's $8,000 a year for out of country expat tuition. So it's so much cheaper than the US school system. So I'm like, this is crazy. So I'm like shipping all my kids to Europe. But yeah, I wouldn't have really understood that and had I not been a part of this group. So I think surrounding yourself with good mentors, a very, very good peer group that has a mindset, like growth mindset, is hugely important to being successful, because there are a lot of skills that translate from the SEAL teams to the business world, but there are a lot that don't. Like, there's things that we do in the SEALs because of the nature of warfare that don't translate. Like, you can't just screw everybody over for the mission, right? In business, you want to build relationships and take care. And so, eventually that person or group may be a customer, but there are a lot of skills that translate and a lot that don't. And the challenges for me was, okay, I got to surround myself with people that are successful in business and learn what skills to take with me, because it's not a lot of SEALs transition into business very, very, very well. Because I think ego gets in the way. You come from the top military community, you're one day you're on top, the next day you're out, and you don't have your uniform on anymore. And I think people struggle with like letting that identity go. And I think you see it in other areas. Like Michael Phelps talks about it with the Olympic gold medalists. Like some people like go into this deep depression because that was their identity, right? The Olympics, being an Olympian. Now they've won gold medal, probably too old to kind of get a chance at the next time, typically. But eventually that has to go away. Like, you can't be an Olympian. And then what comes next, right? You have to figure out what to do. And that's an amazing documentary. I forget the name of it, but he does a really good kind of mental health documentary telling his story of dealing with, identity, lack of purpose, and depression, which I've seen from my own SEAL community. A lot of these guys struggle with kind of, letting it go. It's okay to acknowledge that you're a SEAL, but hey, if you want to build another career, you got to put in the time to learn the trade.
Yeah. And that's happening to a lot of people where they are just in this, they've done something for 20, sometimes 30 years. And now you're like thrusted into a different industry and it feels like you're starting all over again. And that's why I love, how you break it down and just the transitioning of learning as you go along. But I love how you talked about, just who's around you, because who is around you does affect what you see, right? It does affect how you think. And you talk about this in the book where it's really good. It's called The Law of the Most, right? When you talk about what most people are doing. Well, when you're around people that are not like most, because you say in your book, most is like average, that is, I think average is your path to death, right? And so in terms of people just understanding this is why listening to good podcasts, this is why, reading people would think like, what could I learn from a Navy SEAL? I promise you, I read a lot of books. I would pick this up because you break it down so very well. I'm going to get your new book, Steel Fear, because I think just how you write, it's very, very real. And I think that's one thing that you have that is missing in a lot of people. It makes you very relatable, even though you're not like most. You absolutely are not like most. And I just,
I was going to say this, the thing that would surprise, so Steel Fear was my first, John and I, who've written together for years. John has made me a much better writer. Everybody probably has heard or read The Go-Giver, and that John was one of the authors, co-authors on that.
With Burke?
Yeah, him and Bob
Burke.
So, and so, basically, now I lost my train of thought.
So you're talking about
Steel Fear. Steel Fear. So for one, I decided to have the right mindset in the pandemic. I said, you know what? I'm going to have the best pandemic possible. People are sulking and binge watching Netflix. Like, I'm going to really use this time to kind of push ahead and try some different things. So I did the vitamin startup that ended up, we ended up closing that up. But the success that we did have, I said, now is the time for John and I to sell this piece of fiction we've been working on called Steel Fear, which was about a serial killer on an aircraft carrier, which is a huge floating city of 6,000 people. And I said, this is a great time for us to kind of shift. John and I both talked about, making the shift into fiction. And we sold that book for a record advance. It was a bidding war. We ended up going with Random House and a great editor, Ann Spire. So Steel Fear was also inspired by my time in the Navy. Before I was a SEAL, I was on 2 aircraft carriers as a search and rescue swimmer in a helicopter squadron. One was the Abraham Lincoln, the next was the USS Kitty Hawk. The Lincoln was a very interesting experience for me because the captain of the Lincoln was not a great leader. We had a high accident rate in the Navy. You never heard the captain come over we call it the 1MC. It's the main microphone for the whole ship. He never really came over and talked to us. When I went on the Kitty Hawk, I was like, man, the captain talks to the crew every day. The ship is like something like 60 years older than the Lincoln. It's in much better shape. The morale is high. And it was because this guy was a good leader. Back to the Lincoln, we had just integrated women into combat roles in the Navy. And we had this like sexual predator on the ship. He was assaulting women in the shower at night, and they didn't catch this guy. It happened like 6-7 times. The women are terrified. And I was thinking years later, I was like, imagine if this was like a Hannibal Lecter type, using this environment of the aircraft carrier and the bad leadership that went along with it to wreak havoc. And that was the origin story for Steel Fear. But it is you could, even though it's a like crime military thriller, you could teach a leadership lesson off of Steel Fear. There are many, many examples of great and poor leadership in that book. So I think your audience will find that they'll be surprised in a similar way that I love Ayn Rand, right, for weaving in her philosophy into books like Atlas Shrugged, and, which is an incredible book. But anyway, yeah, Steel Fear, check it out. It's a good one.
I'm gonna get it, and I really want to say this. It takes a lot for someone to reinvent themselves. And I studied my whole life to be a doctor. Then I came into insurance, and if you came to me when I was in my young 20s and said I wouldn't be a doctor, I would say, you have no idea who I am, right? And you think about your journey, Brandon, how many times you have reinvented yourself. I just want to say that it's like, it has me tugging and thinking like, don't be afraid. Like, you could have easily taken that path to say, like, let me just finish this. Let me retire, spend those extra couple years, get that base retirement. But what would you have lost? In that time, you learned to grow a business. The business didn't do well, but everything you learned went into everything under the Hurricane Group. And you could have just wasted those years doing, just passing time to get, the little bit of the base retirement. So I just want to commend you for that. I think it's amazing. I'm excited to see what you do next, because you know, what I know is that you will not rest. You will all be on to the next thing. And I hope you continue to apply violence of action in everything that you do, because you have a lot of fans, and we're going to get your book, and I'll read it. And I can't wait to possibly have a future conversation with you, because it's been so great. I thank you for your time today. Really, really do.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
God bless you.